Few. All right. Sort of.
Welcome everyone to our fifth webinar for 2025 for ACGR. It's wonderful to see you all joining us here today from across the country. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands that I'm joining you from today, the Darug people, and thank them for their ongoing care of this land and pay respects to their elders past and present. I'd also like to extend that respect to the traditional owners of the lands that you're joining us from today, and to also welcome any Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people on the call. We're very fortunate today to have the team from Trobe University, the Research and Education Development team, and also to have the team from Cruxes Innovation. So we have Jonathan Lacey and Emily Chang from Cruxes, and we have Dr. Megan Taylor, Dr. Callie Gurin, Dr. Catherine Firth, and Associate Professor Dan Bendrips, who's the PVC of Graduate Research at La Trobe University, to present some wonderful work that they've been doing, looking at helping graduate research students think about what impact looks like for research training students, and approaching and explain their approach to linking impact to other discussions around post-HDR careers. These are really important conversations for our HDR students, not only for their futures, but for also the future of what we're trying to achieve in graduate research and beyond for our candidates. So I don't want to take up too much time in the beginning of the session, so I will hand it over to Dan.
Thank you, Tracy, and welcome everybody. I'm just attempting to share a screen here so that I can provide you with a PowerPoint that we've developed. I hope you can see that now. Just give me a thumbs up to let me know. Yep. Okay, excellent. Hi, great to have you here. I will introduce the teams again in a minute so you can sort of hear a little bit more from all of us. But we've come in today to have a conversation with you really about research impact, specifically in the research training context. And we wanted to bring you some insight from a program that we developed here at La Trobe in partnership with Cruxes. And we wanted to use this as a launch off point for really trying to elicit some commentary and some questions, some interaction from the group, if we can get there before the end of lunch, just to really open up the discussion around impact, because it's a term that's been with us for quite some time, and is understood in all sorts of different ways. And it is also kind of a bit of it's how we go about talking about research impact in the research training context is a little bit of a wicked problem as well. We're going to give you some insight into an attempt that we all made to address that. Not saying it's necessarily kind of it's the gold standard or the best work ever, or, the sort of the most successful way of doing this, just an attempt to get that conversation going in a way that's productive and useful for graduate researchers, with some sort of pretty big and lofty aims as well. So, we want to, the reason we want to share this with you is to also, I guess, reveal a little bit of our own vulnerability in the process, give you a sense that if this is something you're potentially thinking about or struggling with at your own institution, you're not alone. These struggles are everywhere, and to build a little bit of that practice sharing through the sector, through the sharing of examples, I guess. So that's really what we're here to do. As I said, there'll be opportunities for interaction before we hit the end. As you can see, good old Charles La Trobe there is experiencing impact firsthand, in the manner in which his statue has been inverted on the grounds of La Trobe University, whilst also experiencing the impact of the Matildas. But I'm just going to jump out of the way for a moment. I'm going to hand over to my lovely colleague, Megan Tyler, for some terms. I know, Tracy's already sort of invited us and acknowledged country. I'll acknowledge I'm joining us from Jarrah country today here, just south of Bendigo as well. But Megan, over to you
I
for a
was going to
moment.
say, as lovely as I am, I think maybe it's Cruxes.
Oh, yeah, over to Cruxes first. Sorry, look at this. It's almost like we didn't plan it in advance. Um, I I'm just looking at the way that the slides are showing now. A little bit about the red team before we go there. So, the Research Education Development team at La Trobe University is a small crack team of academics with expertise in research and development, various aspects of it, who are who sit centrally and provide a range of different programs and workshops and seminars and initiatives and resources and learning and support for researchers across the university. Most of our work is with graduate researchers. You can see here some descriptions of some of the, some depictions of some of the programs that we run. Obviously, there's a link there, and we've shared that as well to so you can see, I guess, more broadly the scope and the nature of the programs that we deliver. I guess one of the features of our program is it's researcher led. So, we get it when we're talking to other researchers, we know kind of where we're coming from when they experience challenges or have questions or have things that they want to raise with us as well. So, this is the context of the work from our perspective. And as Tracy introduced us there, this is a team that has a number of really cool members, Kelly, Catherine, Megan, and myself. Yeah, I guess all joining today, and we share out between us different aspects of responsibilities for different parts of that program, stretching from orientation all the way through to supervisor development. So that's just a little bit about the red team if you hadn't come across any of us before. Um, Cruxes, can I hand over to you, Em and Jonathan, just to say a word or two about yourselves?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I think thank you. There's a little bit about us on the next slide. Firstly, just want to thank the La Trobe team for giving us the opportunity to join this presentation. A very, very brief introduction to Cruxes Innovation. We know that research leaders, like the people in this audience here, are very motivated to unlock the huge potential of Australian researchers in this amazing research system that we've created here in Australia, to unlock the potential of those researchers to actually solve some of the most wicked problems that are facing our country and our world today. Um, we are also committed to that mission. And what we specifically do at Cruxes Innovation is we design and deliver training and coaching programs that help researchers build their skills, their networks, and their confidence to unlock the potential of their research to make a positive difference in the world. So that's at the core of what we do. We'll say a little more in a moment about the way that we've worked with Dan's team to achieve the very specific aims that we're going to talk about here today. But that's a very, very brief introduction to Cruxes Innovation, who we are and what we do. In fact, in the process of doing that, we came into existence as a company in early 2000. And since then, we have worked with over 2,000 researchers across Australian universities at more than 35 Australian universities to help them unlock that potential.
Jonathan, thank you. That's great. So to kind of get you, that's the introductions, to get you sort of I get in the mood for the discussion that we're about to have. There's a couple of big words that seem to come up again and again in this. We've been talking impact. We're going to talk a lot about industry. So sometimes when you have these conversations about impact, you might feel a little bit like this.
Perfect segue. Okay, so we thought we would start out with the terminology because it's something that comes up a lot for us when we're working in this space in higher education. So using the word impact can be quite vague and amorphous to many, and for others it conjures up imagery like this, or perhaps like a meteor striking Earth. I once had a colleague say to me, every time it's mentioned, they just think of an impacted tooth. So the language doesn't always help us here. Especially when we're actually talking about something pretty cool, positive influence outside of the academy, very generally speaking. It needn't be as painful as being slapped by Batman or going to the dentist. And then on to the next one, when we talk about impact, as Dan said, we also often talk about industry, where we have similar language issues. We don't just mean heavy machinery or corporate collaboration, but that's often how it's perceived. And it is perhaps another indication really of how obsessed with itself academia really is. That industry is often just used to mean anything outside of the academy. It's literally everything out there in the world that isn't right happening now in universities. But this frequently has to be explained, we've found, because particularly for those based in disciplines like the humanities and social sciences, the term industry doesn't sound very inclusive of what they do, and it often has to be pointed out that this can mean community groups, NGOs, and non-profit entities, for instance. So there are kind of caveats out of the way at the beginning about language and things to keep in mind as we go through.
Thank you, Megan. So just to recap there, research impact is about the difference we make in the world. You've probably heard a lot about our social license in the media recently, our license to operate as universities in Australia. Research impact is one of the things that helps reinforce that. It has environmental, technological, economic, medical, cultural, social, developmental dimensions. There's lots of different ways that you can achieve impact. Impact is often talked about in the context of this area that is industry that sits beyond academia, as if academia itself is not somehow industrious and an industry in and of itself. But it also sits, within academia, that you can have, that there is a type of impact that you can have on your discipline, in your discipline, for your discipline, etc. There's the impact that we all have as supervisors of the graduate researchers that we support. Many different ways, sort of internally and externally, that we experience that. One of the challenges with impact, of course, is definitions keep shifting and changing. Agencies will come up with their own ones. In fact, quite helpfully in Australia right now, the ARC and the NHMRC both have impact definitions that are differently worded. So, that's helpful. But it's not a new concept. This is not something that we're struggling to kind of understand as of yesterday. This is the idea that research should have some sort of measurable, demonstrable, and beneficial change is something that's been with us for a very long time. What is a little bit new, and what is the thing that perhaps causes more consternation, is how we go about measuring impact as opposed to, research impact itself. Because the impact of research arises from the work, right, of academics working in systems that need to value and understand the scale of this work. To understand it, they need to measure it. These measures then inform decisions about individual performance and collective institutional performance. Institutions like to know sometimes where they sit, perhaps on a ladder or in a ranking system in relation to everyone else, as to whether their impact is, seems to be increasing or decreasing in the world. This is where it starts to get a little trickier. It became a metric in the RAF, I think, potentially as one of the first places to measure in 2014. And over the course of the subsequent sort of decade was followed, pretty much in every other system, including ours in the last round of ERA. So, there's impact, and separately to that, the question of how we go about measuring and defining impact. These measures, though, are interesting and sort of quixotic in a way as well, because whilst on the one hand, systems like RAF and ERA have very technical ways of measuring this that relate to the kind of the concerns that universities are already kind of dealing with in terms of their own metrics. The pathways to impact include other things like, collaboration, consumer participation, commercialization of ideas, social enterprise, consultancy, involvement in public discourse. These really important things that sometimes get picked up in sort of institutional measures and sort of in terms of the kind of the outputs of university research, but then again, don't necessarily always present themselves for easy measurement. So then where do graduate researchers sit in all of this? Well, I guess one of the things that we noticed, and the thing that we're kind of bringing this conversation to you today for, is that there's a couple of observations that we had. So first and foremost, there's parts of the university, there's unevenness, right, in institutions themselves. There are parts of the university that are inherently kind of considering impact programs that are very applied, for example. There are certain sort of types of work that lend themselves to consideration of the different types of impact that we've talked about, very obviously. And then there are others that where it might be a little bit more tangential, or where the impetus to think about research impact may in fact be something that people need to be led towards, as opposed to something that comes naturally as part of disciplinary culture. For most academics, that leading towards impact has actually happened as a result of these efforts by these big measuring systems to measure and report institutionally on impact. There's lots of academics in Australian universities who perhaps found themselves thinking about impact for the first time because they were being measured on it, because this was something that era was asking for. And so they've been inducted into an impact discussion via institutional reporting requirements. That's okay. That happens in a lot of ways with the work that we do in universities. We do things when the institutions that we work with require us to do so. Graduate researchers, though, are in a slightly different position, because if they're not necessarily staff, they're not necessarily captured in institutional reporting the same way, nor are they inducted into the necessities of impact consideration in the same way that their supervisors might have been. So again, it's this kind of the classic case of graduate researchers just sitting in that slightly liminal position, right? Of not just being students, being more than that, but also not quite being staff, and therefore not subject to the same kinds of pressures but also sort of workforce logics that sit around researchers who are paid and employed to undertake that work, and therefore subject to the kinds of measurement that have been applied through these processes. Thus, they miss out a little bit, or sort of are at risk of missing out because they sit betwixt and between these forces. Well, I'll say one more thing, and then I'm going to hand back to Emily and Jonathan for the next bit. Why does it matter? Well, as Megan said right at the start, career paths for graduate researchers, as we know, are more diverse than ever. Less than half of graduate researchers are going into the academy or into universities in general as a future source of work. Centralised and state funding seems to be becoming less reliable as a source of future research support. So, people need to look for opportunities in the private sector as well. For those who are going into academia, well, having a really clear sense of their impact agenda will actually help them meet future work requirements. It's sort of, future-proofing them for the work that they will be doing in that context. But even more so going into industry, because there it's actually kind of the imperative to do so is even clearer when you're trying to enable connections and shore up future support with others. But these are the things that we see. But we also, at the same time, would say that our approach into these discussions needs to be nuanced, so that we're not alienating potential audiences who potentially may not be fully on board with the idea of why they should be thinking about the impact of their research in these applied terms. Okay, we did a bunch of things to then try and bridge this gap and get the discussion of impact happening with graduate researchers. And to talk about that, I'm going to pass over to our colleagues at Cruxes.
Thanks, Dan. So our involvement in this story that we're going to that we'd like to kind of, or this picture we'd like to paint for you in the next few minutes, goes back almost 6 years to the point when La Trobe had just appointed a new Pro Vice Chancellor Industry Engagement. So this is Megan Fisher, whom some of you will know. And one of the first things that she did when she arrived at La Trobe is, given the breadth of research that was going on across La Trobe, and given, as Dan and Megan have said, the broad definition that we recognize these days of research impact, and the diversity of pathways that to research impact that exist. One of the first things that Megan Fisher did in her new role was what she wanted to do was to look again at review and perhaps refresh La Trobe's intellectual property policy. And so we, Cruxes Innovation, were brought in to assist with that. That then morphed into a project to reflect the new thinking about intellectual property, the broader thinking about knowledge generation across the university, to reflect that in a series of e-learning resources which were designed for all research staff, but particularly targeted at graduate researchers. So that was really kind of the starting point. At least for us in this story, was to help work with La Trobe to help refresh the IP policy and then reflect that broader thinking in a new series of e-learning resources. That then led to some following steps, which Emily's going to talk about.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Jonathan. And part of the reason why we're sort of, I guess, taking you through a little bit of that historical context is, I think, as Dan alluded, we've been really quite fortunate to work alongside the team in La Trobe over the last kind of 5-6 years. And the way that we sort of, now we reflect back on, the 5-6 years, we sort of, come to that really nice kind of, when you look back in hindsight, go, oh, it all kind of makes sense, but in the moment, it very much was an experiment, an iterative approach in terms of responding to some specific needs or some specific opportunities to jump on. And for example, Jonathan mentioned that identification of, hey, maybe the starting point is via a policy review, and then realizing, right, it's one thing to say let's kind of review and develop some new documents or kind of descriptions around the policy. Then we sort of go, well, how do we then bring that, how do we socialize, engage this policy with the academics, the researchers, and also everybody else that's involved. So one of the things that we sort of reflected on was really this approach very much was much more of an organic and sort of a forward experimental kind of iteration where we sort of identified these are opportunities, particularly jumping on, from the changes around industry engagement and that shift in emphasis around, sort of, I guess, funding towards research that is going to be more applied, translational kind of focus. So that was kind of certainly one of the starting points of the focus of the work that we sort of worked together on in terms of developing online resources that really was focusing on supporting initially, I think, the academics and the supervisors to be able to be comfortable with thinking about how their research would be valuable for industry, how they might bring and collaborate with industry for impact. And that then sort of evolved with particularly the introduction of La Trobe's new research strategy and vision. So what we then sort of did was actually then dovetail and align these kind of online material into the university sort of overall strategy as well. And at that same time, we were sort of then starting to think about it's great that we've starting to get traction and sort of engagement from the academics, but as Dan mentioned, we were really sort of thinking quite hard about, well, how do we then sort of involve the graduate researchers, because as Dan mentioned, probably a little bit different in terms of graduate researchers is that there isn't as much of a clear, I guess, lever and mechanism to bring them into the conversation. And so we then worked together to design a number of different workshops that we were sort of bringing to the graduate researchers. Say, hey, here are some workshops that might be of interest to you, particularly starting with, I guess, inviting them to consider where are some of the industry engagement opportunity of their research, and then actually realizing that didn't quite, sort of, hit the mark for many of the graduate researchers, even though they sort of, many of them said, oh, that would be really interesting, really of value, but we didn't really see the behavior come through in terms of, we put forward these workshops, but we didn't necessarily get a huge amount of uptake from them. And what the last sort of, I guess, pivot or kind of reorientation that we've then made is really kind of starting to think about how do we connect research impact to their careers, really driving into personally why would them as individuals want to and are motivated to consider and put effort in connecting in with research impact, outside of the academic kind of impact. That was really where we sort of, I guess, this is the I guess latest sort of approach that we're taking, is really trying to align research impact with career prospects.
Thanks, Em. I'm going to jump in. Just, I know I said I wouldn't, but I'll just
No.
one more component to that, which
Yeah.
is, in addition to all of that, we had sort of other policy developments going along, at the same time as well. And one of the areas that we were able to kind of think about ways of including graduate researchers in the broader impact discussion was, by including them in the impact strategy as well. So the university had, developed up a research impact strategy. Graduate researchers appear in there both as kind of as creators of impact, but also impact as an enabler of graduate research success. So as a way of actually attracting graduate researchers as well. So it's this kind of mutually reinforcing loop, alongside all the other things you said about the bigger picture institutional goals, as well as those kind of individual future career opportunity goals as well. Yeah, I'm going to move the slide forward for you now.
Thanks, Dan, because I think that's a beautiful segue in terms of, I think that's a really great example about those design considerations, where we really were, I think, kind of realizing that in order to, I guess, support as many people, whether it's academics or graduate researchers, towards thinking about and working on, I guess, raising their impact awareness and sort of activities, we really needed to sort of take a kind of holistic and sort of cultural kind of approach, rather than, I think, I guess, a programmatic, sort of workflow of, okay, this is a change initiative and here are all the, sort of targeted activities. I think one of the design approaches that we took were really around identifying, what's really going on from the university, from the university, where is people's energy at, and how do we sort of use a more development and an opt-in approach, rather than, here's a set of, sessions, webinars, and come and attend. What we kind of ended up doing is, as much as it put a lot more stress on our side, because we really were thinking really quite hard around, like, how do we describe, position, communicate these development opportunities in a way that would entice academics and graduate researchers to want to come in and sort of join this movement that we're sort of supporting. And kind of one of the things that we really did was both opportunistic, identifying where is the energy at across the university, but also in parallel have an ongoing I guess a program that was available for any graduate researcher or academic to participate in, that was a base program. So we've been sort of really kind of fortunate to be working with La Trobe, making the base program available for the staff and kind of graduate researchers of the university over the last probably 3 years or so. And that, I think, in reflection, has been also one of the really valuable parts of this approach, is having something that is available continuously, so that if and when an academic does sort of come to that realization, or have been recommended to say, hey, you really should participate in the space program, it's available, they can sign up, and they can get started in that journey. Now, of course, that these things, are never, you design in theory to kind of make it all work, and it's going to be quite exciting. Everyone wants to kind of join in and jump on. But of course, that in reality was never the case. We obviously, learned quite a lot along the way. We've kind of tested, and some things, didn't quite work out as we wanted. Particularly as we talked about, there's certainly high interest in terms of we definitely got a number of both the supervisors and the graduate researchers saying, yes, this workshop, is going to be great, it's super valuable, but we didn't necessarily see the behavior that, followed through. And that, again, also, learning for us in terms of, okay, how do we then adjust to that? How do we make sure that you know, these opportunities are available, both you know, having kind of synchronous engagement, whether it's workshops, you know, conversations, but also having sort of online you know, sort of, you know, material that they can engage in, you know, as and when they're ready and they have a need. So that's something that we really had to you know, sort of, I guess, learn and iterate through that. And also that shifting definition of impact. I think you know, as Dan and Megan talked about, the way that we shifted, we sort of ended up having probably multiple versions of you know, describing impact, describing why impact matters, describing, you know, the value of it, because we were really also needing to respond to the changing kind of narrative that was going on as well. Certainly, you know, we kind of recognize that when we initially put forward these online resources and workshops, where it did have a really strong emphasis around industry engagement, and that certainly that language you know, certainly, you know, sort of made it really difficult for parts of the university to kind of engage and you know, sort of feel like they can be part of it. And the other one, we kind of we ran a workshop around demystifying internships, and you know, that was a big learning for us in terms of, you know, that terminology. Internships was something that was quite foreign and quite alienating for, you know, for particular research disciplines, and so that kind of way of sort of us continuously evolving the language was also something that, again, is a bit of a challenge, because it's not quite a you build it once and you launch it and then it'll work. It was something that we kept having to kind of refine and sort of iterate on. The other thing in terms of challenges is also sort of that measuring of the outcomes as well, because we, you know, we didn't necessarily take a sort of a programmatic approach with, you know, defined you know, sort of activities, milestones where we were sort of tracking. That also, I think, made it difficult in terms of us reflecting on, well, how do we know that, you know, these different initiatives, activities, you know, did make a difference. That also, I think, was part of the challenge and sort of, I guess, limitation of this approach that we took. So last part in terms of the insight gains, and hopefully this might kind of catalyze some of your questions, some of your reflections as well, is that, you know, at least I think from our where we're sitting, reflecting on, you know, I guess there was a deliberate choice in wanting to weave impact conversations into as many parts of what's going on in the university, was something that I think, you know, was really I guess played really well in parts of our activities, but obviously, you know, had some disadvantages as well. I think the other insight is really kind of trying to embed impact discussions into different activities in the research ecosystem, you know, both in terms of supervisor support, graduate researcher support, you know, different parts of industry engagement, partnerships. That was also, I think, something that really helped in terms of, in some ways, it's kind of like you can't, you know, anywhere you look across the universities, there'll be something that that will hopefully remind you of you know, the conversation that we're trying to have around impact. And also sort of having that ongoing, I think, partnership that the Red team has had with the industry engagement and the commercializations team, I think was really quite helpful, because we could continue to sort of work alongside each other. They were sort of feeding us, you know, some of the focus, some of the emphasis that they are looking to kind of make, and then obviously, you know, us with the Red team responding to, well, how do we enable those changes through a development lens, which I think was kind of the sort of insights around building that internal partnership across the university to enable impact conversations to happen. I might pause it, leave it there. Dan, feel free, or Megan, feel free to kind of add in any other insights that you'd like to kind of share.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think from our perspective, you know, having such a wonderful partnership with you at Cruxes did allow us to reiterate that developmental perspective. It wasn't seen as a centralized top-down metrics-driven approach. And I think that also did help us counteract to some degree the grumpy Bernie Sanders vibes that were represented in the challenges, there is always an academic at the back of the room that says it's more of a comment than a question. And so I think, you know, I've been that academic. I feel like I can say that. But that the kind of energy that you were able to then bring to it, and the fact that I think that insight that you gave us as well about doubling down where you do have interest and do have that energy, and kind of building that social license from there, kind of snowballing it, can be a much, much better approach than compulsory and dealing with a room full of grumpy Bernie Sanderses. Yep. And then just as Em said, hopefully that's kind of brought up some questions for you along the way. So returning all the way back to the beginning and the Batman and heavy industry pictures, are there misconceptions and frustrations that you encounter around impact discussions at your own institution? I'd love to add to more imagery outside the impacted tooth if you've encountered them yourself. What are your experiences of bringing research impact discussions to graduate researchers specifically? Obviously, we've highlighted a number of the challenges and ways that we've tried to adapt to that. Are there any approaches you've found that have helped or you would not try again? And what are you thinking of moving on to trying next? We would love to hear about that, as well as any questions you might have for any of us too.
Thank you.
I'm going to allow you to wrangle the Q&A, Dan.
And I shall. So thank you, folks. Really over to you now. I'm going to put the PowerPoint away so that I can actually see your faces and pay attention to any comments, questions that might be coming up in the chat. There's lots of ways we can do this. We can use the chat, as some people already have, to get ideas across. You're also welcome to put your hand up, or if you're feeling particularly brave, just shout out and insert yourself into the conversation. Lots of different ways to get that started. I can see from Jenny though in the chat, yeah, frustrations include examples of what might count. Yeah, indeed. We address that. Yeah, we found that in our workshops, spending a lot of time talking about all the different things that people were talking about that they believed to count as impact. The things that the university was communicating seemed to count as impact, and the kind of the overlap, you know, between those two things, because it's not a one of the challenges is about getting people to understand that the impact that they might value themselves may or may not have the same set of values for the institution, depending on what it is that the institution is aiming for. So it's not that the institution doesn't think the work is valuable, it's just that the work isn't meeting whatever the other targets are that the institution is trying to address through this whole process. And that can be quite an alienating experience for people when you realize that the thing that you value the most is actually not potentially something that's sitting outside of a bigger picture institutional agenda. But it's a really good question, Jenny.
Yeah, Dan, I just want to jump in. Certainly from our experience as well, we've also, I think, we often observe when we coach researchers in the way that they think about it and kind of articulate the impact measures. There's always two lenses. One is what is the organization expectations, but also often if the research is aligned to funding, external funding, that also is something that I think we find ourselves reminding or encouraging researchers to be curious about, what is the impact framework that the funding organization has, and what is it that how do you need to describe and define your research that aligns to their impact, sort of framework and measures.
Thank you. There's some great comments coming up in the chat. Vijay's got a question here on sort of speaking on behalf of social scientists in general, which is, how can we demonstrate measurable impact beyond citations, particularly in influencing policy, for example? Any suggestions about indicators to capture this kind of impact? What do you think, folks? Who'd like to take that one up?
Can I just add, I think, because it ties in maybe with a few of the comments in the chat there and great questions, is that I think in the workshops, at least, that Em and I developed, is that it was trying to broaden the discussion beyond actually what the university values as metrics. Because if you start there, the conversation ends pretty quickly for all the reasons I think you've just highlighted, Dan. And so if we could take the most inclusive, broad definition of impact actually, as, let's say, positive influence, then almost everyone in the room does want to achieve that with their research. They do want people to read it, and they generally want more than just their two peer reviewers to read it. And so it was often tapping into that motivation and saying, okay, you might not like the word impact to describe that for whatever reason, but how about we follow that and we think about, with curiosity, just as Em has said, all of the ways in which you might be, you know, we have a great focus in research communication in the RED program as well, that like, who might your interested audiences be? How might you reach them? And kind of, I guess, beginning with that more lower level discussion, and hopefully then finding evidence of that, building it in, as someone mentioned in the chat too, early on, trying to get people to think of it as something that is embedded in their research project, not as an add-on. And then you've kind of got the evidence that you might be able to fit into the university metrics rather than working backwards and often trying to force fit what I think is seen as a very STEM mentality into non-STEM disciplines. And so you are sometimes left with that feeling of, well, if not policy change, what else could I possibly have done? So I guess we try and encourage them to be creative and open up that discussion as much as possible.
Indeed. And I guess the other sort of side to, and coming back to your question as well, VJ, is you know, sometimes the turnaround time on these things is different to what we might be hoping. So, you know, influence on like policy can be very, very long form. Sometimes it's about being ready to acknowledge that that's the case. You know, that the time frame in which you might be trying to sort of describe this impact might be greater than is comfortable or desired. And also like doing really, really good record keeping, you know, like that, just that kind of that background work of going, okay, here are the circumstances under which I engaged with these ministers in these ways, you know, here are the things that I wrote or was involved in that were sort of part of that. So you've got to kind of, you know, it's not just apparent in a policy change itself, but there's this whole sort of background of work that's gone on that may not be academic work, that may not have contributed to, you know, a paper, but is seeking to do other things. You know, that work is still important and valuable work, even if it's not being kind of valued through publications. So I think, yeah, that kind of your own kind of record keeping around the actual work that you're actually doing to make a difference in the world is actually part of this, you know, as well. That's what people forget. We all know about, we also all hear about the successes, right? But all those grants that we apply for that we never get, that's actually doing something, you know, as well, in terms of the successes that we see. While I've been talking, a whole bunch of things have come up in the chat. I'm just going to sort of do my best to try and triage these now, because it's really great to see this engagement. I'm hoping people are sort of reading the comments as we're talking as well. Jenny makes the point that, yeah, that metrics themselves can be confused with the impact. You know, that's a very good point as well. The misconception, Hong Lin says that, you know, that this is somehow or other to the PhD. I think this is a big part of our the insight that we've gained from the work that we've done was that the least success we had in trying to develop an impact sort of agenda with graduate researchers was to add it to their to their agenda. Every time we added it, we didn't get the impact we were expecting. We did it by embedding it so that it was never seen as being something additional, that this is just part and parcel of what you're already doing. And there's different ways that we talk about that. And yeah, so as Annie says, same applies potentially to people who are already career academics. People talking about supervisors, which is great, and the important role of supervisors in that process. Hunting now for questions in and amongst these comments. If there's anything I've missed that people would like to talk to, please put your hand up. But we're getting there. George asks, how do you get your research in front of people studying science outreach for primary school teachers? Oh yeah, concern my paper will only impact in the program I'm looking at and not inform science outreach in a greater conversation. Really great question, George. How do we actually get in front of the people that we want to impact with the work and ideas that we're producing, folks? How do we do it? Emily, Jonathan, Catherine, Kelly, Megan.
Yeah, happy to jump in. And one thing that it's really interesting. So this is actually a really common question that we kind of focus on when we're coaching researchers. One of the things that we've seen a couple of researchers maybe just switch maybe the way they design the research from separating between research participants and the people that they're looking to impact, you know, as a result of, you know, the results, the findings of the research being being kind of published. I was coaching a researcher from UNE the other day who actually kind of just got thinking through, well, is there, again, obviously we need to think about ethics and all that sort of jazz, which is, certainly. But one thing that kind of he realized is, the research that he was working on was looking at supporting sort of program, particularly community social social enterprise program managers to change the way that they approach their coachees, if you will, in kind of rural communities. And when he was developing his research, he kind of just thought about these community managers as research participants, and they go, oh, great, I've got these research participants. I'll collect all this information, and then I'll come up all these findings and recommendations, and then I'll find another group of people which this finding is going to benefit. And we kind of go, well, actually, they're the same group of people. Like, you've already got them, you've already recruited these sort of research participants. They're actually potentially your first group of early adopters in sort of influencing the change. And so maybe not just think of these people as research participants, but also think about them as part of the engagement impact of your research, and really kind of extending that out. And that seemed to really kind of help quite a lot for him in kind of just shifting the way that he approaches the design of the research. It's almost kind of not thinking about research design and kind of delivery as one thing, and then impact on the other thing as a separate category. As Dan said, it's really kind of how do we sort of bake in impact as part of research design and delivery. Hopefully that's one small story and example.
Thanks, Emily, and thanks for sharing that. We've got Callie brings up altmetrics in the chat as well, which is worth sort of thinking about as well. And I think sort of altmetrics is an interesting kind of idea as well, because it's alternative to what? Well, to the traditional sort of academic metrics that we use. Yeah, but any metric is a metric, right? It depends on how you deploy it and what sort of justification you're using to deploy that metric in this context. We work within systems where certain kinds of metrics are privileged or prioritized or seen as being more important for specific reasons. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't opportunities to test out the waters of different ways of talking about the impact of your work beyond, the ways in which that information is already collected. I mean, I think one of the things that I've learned from working with Cruxes and from talking to all of our graduate researchers about this stuff is actually that, like, you can have a go at talking about impact in lots of different ways, potentially, and you don't have to just use this. It's important to understand the ways in which universities measure themselves, and if that's important to your work, to abide by that. But that doesn't mean you're restricted from then also doing other things. Like a lot of researchers have been through the period of doing that on social media or through developing blogs or podcasts or that kind of stuff. Maybe there's other things that you can do as well, right? Maybe there's different sorts of social groupings that you as a researcher can access that aren't any of those things. That might actually be a pathway to impact because of the nature of the work that you're doing as well. Pint of Science in the Pub is a great example, sort of down here in Melbourne and Bendigo recently, right? Different ways of actually reaching out and engaging. I guess we're drifting here into engagement and communication territory, right? As well. That's the other thing, which are also kind of sitting there on the fringes of this kind of overlapping Venn diagram of impact, engagement, communication. All these things kind of sit together. We've probably got time to address one more thing together before we sort of close the session for today. But there was a question there was a point made, just trying to remember who it was from, possibly Jenny in the chat, about thinking about potential or future impact, which we haven't talked about here yet. So maybe we want to talk about that. Or pick up on any of the other points that have been raised. What do you think, folks? Do you want to sort of finish sort of future forward with just a comment on the idea of future impact or potential, impact potential? Is that something that we need to think about, or how do we think about that when we're talking to people about planning for impact and what that looks like? What do you reckon? Again, I'm sort of looking at you, Emily and Jonathan, in the first instance. And I'm sort of, while you're collecting your thoughts, I say this because it resonates with me. I used to work in a conservatorium environment. You might not think that classical music is necessarily the sort of the space in which we'd be having massive impact discussions. But, we might be producing a Mozart, right? We might be producing someone who's about to have the most unimaginable impact in the world of classical composition. That's potential impact. We don't know who in our current cohort of graduate researchers is going to go on to be that Beethoven or that Mozart. But of any of the areas of the university, we're one of the ones that have the potential to produce it.
And I mean, we did highlight that as a challenge, right, too, just it's hard enough to track for established academics in your institution, but your graduate researchers mostly leave. And as many of you will have dealt with having to do like graduate researcher survey follow-ups, once people have finished their degrees, it's really hard. So trying to track that, especially like you might find the Mozart, but even your mid-level rock star is going to be difficult to, kind of track back. So I think one of the other things that I'm not sure if we've perhaps touched on in terms of linking it to careers, which was part of the embedding, but also, I guess, thinking about that future, tying it to the way in which graduate researchers are trying to imagine something for themselves beyond what they're doing right now, and how much the discussion around impact, or whatever people feel more comfortable calling it in that space, is also about transferable skills. And so, that impact might not be as directly as being the greatest thing in the thing that you're doing now, but you might take stuff that you're learning here and bring it to something very different. And if you do, we'd really like to hear about it. I think that was probably the other, thing to get them to feel like they can check in down the track and at least keep those lines of communication open, which is one thing we do in allowing graduates to continue to come to our workshops, for instance.
Just one more idea to throw in on that question of, if we're working on, or if we're working with researchers whose, in the best case, impact is going to happen in 10, 15, 20 years, what can we do now to know that we're on that they are on the right track? There is actually, and this is a whole nother can of worms, which maybe might be the subject of a future discussion. There is an emerging science of innovation. And I know we're not necessarily talking about innovation here, but there is actually a body of research that has been done over the last 10 years or more, some of which has been done most recently here in Australia, in fact, that has identified a fairly large number of factors which are directly connected to, directly influence, directly drive impact and successful translation and successful adoption of research ideas. So the emerging science is telling us that, although of course there are a large number of factors that we don't control in terms of how much impact some research might have, there are factors that we can identify and support and drive towards in the early stages, which we know are necessary to create impact. And so in the early stages, kind of in real time, we can at least track progress towards achieving those conditions, which will give us a pretty good indication of what the long-term impact potential of the work might be. So that's another approach that we've recently been exposed to, and that we're kind of increasingly building into our work at Cruxes Innovation.
Thank you, Jonathan. And I'll steal the final word by tying that back into researcher development and saying that, therefore, part of the whole idea of research training includes training people to have the skills to be able to do this for themselves in the future. And as Megan said, to also consider how things that they've picked up in the context of one attempt at having impact in the world may in fact benefit them and others through the other things that they do in all the various phases of the things that they will do through their professional and service lives. I'll leave it there. Once again, Callie Guerin, Catherine Firth, Megan Tyler, Emily Chang, Jonathan Lacey, and I'm Dan Bendrups. We're coming to you from the Red team at La Trobe University and Cruxes Innovation. It's been great to share this space with you today. We appreciate you sitting with us through this conversation. We hope it's been valuable to you and that you've gotten something out of the hour you've spent with us. And thank you, of course, to Tracy and the ACGR for the opportunity to come and share on our practice with you today.
Folks, lovely to talk to you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Dan, and thank you everyone for being here. And we hope to see you at one of our future webinars. And I'm thinking one of them may end up being on the science of innovation, Jonathan, because that sounded hugely important for work in this space going forward. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.